Old Grumpy Hunter here. Welcome to Fast Bow Light Arrows. You know that I've made many videos about arrow weight and why it's beneficial to use a heavier arrow than the stock arrow. As a review, here are some of the reasons in no particular order. Reduced noise, lower stress on the bow, increased momentum, increased kinetic energy, increased penetration. I'll take a look at all of those in a bit.
Why are you making another video about arrow weight?
I received an email from one of the big box stores advertising a crossbow that had an advertised initial speed of 405 feet per second. And in the ad it mentioned the arrows, or bolts if you prefer, and the name of the arrows got me curious about the specifications of them. I was wondering if they were either shorter than 20 inches, or of a small diameter, or both. It turns out they were neither. I'm not going to mention the name of the company, or the model of the bow, or the model of the arrows, because I'm not trying to imply that either the bow, or the arrows, or both, are inferior. Here are the bow's stated specifications. I did a search for the arrows and found they weigh 370 grains with a 100 grain point. The company also offers a heavier arrow with a weight of 390 grains with a 100 grain point. The speed loss with the heavier arrow will be approximately 4 feet per second. That is based on the rule of thumb: for every 5 grain change in weight, there will be a 1 foot per second change inversely in speed. In simple terms, if you increase the arrow weight, the arrow speed is going to drop. 390 minus 370 equals 20. 20 divided by 5 equals 4 feet per second. 4 feet per second is not really much to worry about for the most part, or is it? Let's crunch some numbers comparing the two arrows offered for a shot out to 40 yards. You see that the increased weight increased both kinetic energy and momentum, and the flight time is only 3 thousandths of a second longer. So what happens if you use an arrow from a third party, let's say one that weighs 435 grains with the point? First, let's calculate the speed drop. 435 minus 370 equals 65. 65 divided by 5 equals 13. 405 minus 13 equals 392 feet per second. The increased weight increased the kinetic energy about 14 foot-pounds and the momentum by 0.1 slugs. What happens if you take the same third-party arrow and change the point out to 150 grains for a total weight of 485 grains? 485 minus 370 equals 115. 115 divided by 5 equals 23. 405 minus 23 equals 382 feet per second. Compared to the stock arrow, the speed drops by 23 feet per second. But on the other side, both kinetic energy and momentum increase. The kinetic energy by 22 plus foot-pounds and the momentum by 0.16 slugs.
What's this thing you call slugs?
This can be a little confusing here because the term pound is used in both weight and force. A slug is a unit of mass when 1 pound of force is applied to it, results in an acceleration of 1 foot per second per second. 1 slug is approximately 32.17405 pounds of mass. In the British engineering system of units, where forces are expressed as pounds and acceleration as feet per second squared, the mass of the object is expressed in pounds per foot per second squared. In an attempt to avoid confusion between mass and force and to simplify things, a single term was introduced for the combination of the above units: 1 pound per foot per second squared. The term arose from the concept of mass as inertia or slugginess, thus slug. A mass of 1 slug exerts a force of about 32.17 pounds force. Now that's clear as mud, right? This table shows what happens to speed, kinetic energy, and momentum when the arrow weight is increased. It starts with the bow in question, stated initial speed, and recommended arrow. I realize that the table has some unrealistic arrow weights, but you can see the arrow weight can be increased by 450 grains for a total of 820 grains before the kinetic energy starts to drop, and 875 grain increase for a total of 1,245 grains before the momentum starts to drop. Pause the video to study this table if you like. A link to a downloadable file is in the description. Let's go back to the reasons mentioned before and look at them one at a time. Reduced noise. The more energy that is required to launch the arrow, the less energy that the bow has to absorb, which becomes vibration and noise. An arrow weighing 485 grains requires or uses 22.4 foot-pounds more of the stored energy than the 370 grain arrow. Without actually measuring the sound of the two arrows being shot, in theory, the 485 grain arrow would be approximately 18.83% quieter than the 370 grain arrow. On the manufacturer's website, they state, quiet performance, custom rubber shock absorbers, reduced noise and vibration for increased stealth and performance. I wonder if they added that before or after the speed test. Lower stress on the bow. As before, more energy that is used to launch the arrow, less excess energy is put into the bow, which results in less vibration, which in turn results in less stress on the components of the bow. Increased momentum. Momentum is dependent on both mass and velocity equally. And from the different tables you saw that as the weight of the arrow went up, so did momentum. You also saw there was a point where momentum starts to drop. The arrow was weighing in at 1,245 grains and the initial speed was 230 feet per second. Increased kinetic energy. Kinetic energy, like momentum, is dependent on both mass and velocity, but it is more dependent on velocity. In the different tables you saw that as the mass went up, so did the kinetic energy. You also saw that there was a point where kinetic energy started to drop. The arrow was weighing in at 820 grains and the initial speed was 315 feet per second. Increased penetration. Maybe. Momentum is defined as mass in motion. Any object that is moving has momentum because all objects have mass. Momentum is a great reference value, but it's not necessarily a direct indication of penetration because not all momentum is created equally. Let's compare two arrows. Arrow 1 weighs 350 grains and has an initial speed of 400 feet per second. Arrow 2 weighs in at 400 grains and has an initial speed of 300 feet per second. They both have the same momentum. You recall that momentum is mass times velocity. 350 times 400 is the same as 400 times 350. Taking a look at the formula, when mass provides more of the product than velocity, the harder it is to stop a moving object. Newton's first law of motion, the law of inertia, states that an arrow at rest stays at rest, and an arrow in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction. In other words, moving arrows want to keep moving. This resistance to change in motion is called inertia. Think of this. When you make a sudden stop in your vehicle, your body wants to continue moving forward. It is the inertia of your body that keeps it moving. Inertia depends solely on mass. More mass equals more inertia. Objects resist changes in motion differently. This difference varies with mass. The mass of an object is the sole measurement that inertia is dependent upon. The greater the mass, the greater the inertia. The more mass, the greater resistance to changes in state of motion. Both inertia and momentum fight the forces that are trying to slow the arrow down. Forces like air resistance, gravity, and tissue. Newton's second law describes the changes that a force can produce on a body in motion. It states that the body's change of momentum is equal to both strength and direction of the force imposed upon it. Frequently, inertia and momentum are interchanged, but they are two different things. Inertia is the object's resistance to a change in motion. Momentum describes how much motion an object has. We can postulate that the arrow that weighs 390 grains will have more penetration than the one that weighs 370, and that the 435 grain arrow will have even more penetration. Of the four arrows discussed, the one weighing 485 grains will have the greatest penetration of the four, with all things being equal. That being said, there are other factors besides the increased weight that will have effect on penetration. There are many, but let's discuss only bone. Do you hit bone? How thick is the bone? 1 bone or 2 bones? Let's say multiple ribs. There's another term we need to think about with this crossbow. That's grains per pound. For vertical bows, there are at least 2 oversight organizations, and those organizations have a set of recommendations on the minimum arrow weight based on grains per pound of draw weight, GPP. Those organizations have an average GPP of 5.5. That means for every 1 pound of draw weight, the arrow has to have a minimum weight of 5.5 grains. Since I'm not a vertical bow user, reasons are not important for this discussion. I had to do some searching on the World Wide Web. It appears that the draw weights for adult males range for the most part between 50 and 70 pounds. Based on that range, the minimum arrow weight for a vertical compound bow is 275 grains to 385 grains. Wait a minute, a vertical bow with 70 pound draw weight needs a minimum arrow weight of 385 grains, but a crossbow with 210 pounds of draw weight comes with a 370 grain arrow? Something does not sound right. As I mentioned before, there are oversight groups for the vertical bows, but not for crossbows, and there is no official recommendations for GPP for crossbows. I addressed this issue in my video, Grains per Pound, or How Low Can You Go?, along with the minimum GPP that would be for a crossbow. The end result in that video, after crunching a large amount of numbers and digesting what seemed like a ton of information, I concluded that the minimum GPP for a crossbow would be 2.5 to 3 grains. Getting back to the bow in question, it has a draw weight of 210 pounds. The arrow-bow combination using the 370 grain arrow results in 1.76 grains per pound. Using the lower value from the range, the minimum arrow weight for this bow should be 525 grains. That increased weight drops the initial speed down to 374 feet per second. Looking at this table that compares the stock arrow with the arrow that has 2.5 grains per pound, we see that overall, the heavier arrow performs better. As already pointed out, there's an initial speed loss of 31 feet per second, or 7.65%. You see that the heavier arrow retains more of its speed to the target, and at the target the difference of the speed is only 6.5%. The lighter arrow lost 5.65%, and the heavier arrow lost only 4.01%. The kinetic energy of the heavier arrow is 120.93% of the light arrow. At the target, the kinetic energy of the heavier arrows is 125.27% of the light arrow. The initial momentum of the heavier arrow is 130.86% of the light arrow, and at the target, the heavier arrow is 137.7% of the light arrow. Because the heavier arrow has a slower initial speed, it has a longer flight time out to 40 yards. That increased flight time is 0.02 seconds. Which works out to 1/50th of a second. I spoke on kinetic energy earlier, and there's one thing that was stated on the manufacturer's website I have an issue with. In the description of the 390 grain arrow, it reads, "Crossbow bolt delivers maximum penetration to crush big animals with hard-hitting kinetic energy and devastating knockdown power." I'm sorry, an arrow does not kill by force or energy, but by the cutting of the head that results in massive bleeding. I'll get off that soapbox and climb onto another one. Details about their arrows. Comparing the 2 arrows offered by the bow's manufacturer, you can see that the specifications are the same. Length is 20 inches, straightness is 0.003, grains per inch is 9, the inside diameter is 0.30, the outside diameter is 0.346, and the weight tolerance is plus or minus 1 grain. It looks to me that both shafts are the same. What's the difference? Let's do some investigating. The shaft weight is 180 grains. According to Bonning Archery's website, a 3-inch vane weighs 10 grains each, so that's 30 grains for the 3 of them. A moon knock that I've taken out of an arrow that I use has the same inside diameter, weighs 10 grains. The shaft with the vanes and knock added together weigh 220 grains. Adding the point weight, that becomes 320, so that leaves 50 grain insert for the 370 grain arrow, and a 70 grain insert for the 390 grain arrow. Why not just inform the consumer what the insert is made of and its weight? I'll get off that soapbox now.
Why would a manufacturer sell a crossbow that is rated at 405 feet per second and then recommend using an arrow weight of 370 grains?
I'll tell you why. Big numbers sell. In this case 405 and 134.
There's one more thing to be aware of. Somewhere on the box in fine print, there will be a phrase that reads something like,
speeds up to XXX feet per second.
Thank you for watching this Old Grumpy Hunter presentation. Please give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to push the notification bell.